Today, I'm going to be talking about the article Eating Christmas in the Kalahari by Richard Borshali. The article is basically how cultural worldview affects how people interpret actions, especially when different cultures interact. It shows how misunderstandings can happen when someone assumes that their thinking is the correct standard way of thinking. In this article, Lee talks about his experience living in the Coon, people in the Kalahari Desert. He decides to do something nice for the community by buying a large ox so that they can celebrate Christmas together. From this point of view, that was the generous and thoughtful thing to do. But instead of being thankful, the coon started criticizing the ox, saying that it was small and not good. At first, Lee is confused and honestly kind of offended, but later on, he realized that their reaction wasn't meant to be rude, but was actually a part of their culture. The main idea of the article is that the meaning behind their action depends on their cultural worldview, and what seems kind in one culture can be understood completely different in another. This article really shows how worldview affects the way people interpret behavior. Lee comes from a Lee comes from a culture where generosity usually gets recognized with praise and appreciation. The Kung, on the other hand, value humility and equality. Basically, they don't want anyone to feel superior to others, so they downplay the gifts and situations with their cultural lens. He misunderstood the reaction, and what he felt was disrespect was actually meant to protect the balance that they have in their community. A clear example of ethnocentric bias in the article is when Lee assumes that the Kung are being ungrateful. That assumption comes straight from his own cultural expectations. He expected a thank you or excitement because that's what normally would happen in his culture, but by judging the reaction using his own standards and his own personal experiences, he temporarily saw that their behavior was wrong. Once he understood that the reasoning that they had behind it, he realized that the issue wasn't their culture, but his perspective on their culture. The story also faces the idea that another culture's values are quote unquote normal or better than others. At first, the Kung tradition, by criticizing the ox, seemed disrespectful because of his own worldview experiences, but once it's explained, it also makes sense that their culture has their own values that are focused on keeping everyone equal and avoiding pride. This faces the idea that gratitude has to look the same everywhere, and it shows that different cultures solve social problems in different ways. Just because we solve a social dilemma in our society differently doesn't mean it's the wrong or right way. In my own personal culture, a normal value is emphasizing individual success and recognition. And for instance, people are praised for good grades, sports, or finances. But from the Kuhn perspective, this might seem a bit unnecessary or even harmful because it can create competition and even an ego. An outsider with their worldview might not see praise as encouraging, but something that disrupts unity. One of the best practices for communicating across cultures is to take a second and pause and think before judging and trying to understand where the other side is coming from instead of assuming that their behavior is rude or disrespectful. It helps us to ask questions and learn more about their background. In this article, once Lee learned why the Kung criticized the ox, everything made sense. This is an example of how important it is to be culturally aware and avoiding misunderstandings in the future. I've also seen cultural misunderstandings in my own personal life where people take behavior the wrong way because they have certain expectations that aren't withheld. For example, some people are very direct, and when they're being honest, it can be seen as rude. This is similar to what happened in the article where the Kung's honesty felt offensive at first. In both situations, the misunderstanding came from different worldviews rather than just seeing more than the bad intentions. Overall, the biggest takeaway that you and I can get from the article Eating Christmas in the Kalahari is that worldview plays a huge role in how we interpret people and different situations. Not everything means the same thing across cultures, and misunderstandings often happen when we assume one way is the default. The article emphasizes the importance of being open minded and aware in certain cultural situations and recognizing differences when communicating with others. Thank you.